I'm happy to announce that March 1st is the official release date of the new Thinking Aloud magazine's first quarterly issue. You can download free PDF copies from the website of the new Thinking Aloud Foundation. If you like a high-quality printed edition as a collectible, you can order it from magcloud.com.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring U.S. military interest in the ostensible paranormal. With me is Dr. John Alexander, a retired senior military officer with 32 years experience in the military. He is one of the foremost proponents, actually, of military interest in the paranormal. Back in 1989, he authored a classic paper titled The New Mental Battlefield, which was published in Military Review, a very important journal of military science. Dr. Alexander is also author of Reality Denied, First-Hand Experience with Things That Can't Happen But Did. His other titles include Future War and also UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Reality. Welcome, John.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. Glad to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and I think a good place to start, since you were in the military for decades.
And 32 years.
32 years, so you've seen it from many different points of view, and I know that one experience that you have that is common amongst combat veterans, or at least I should say it's not uncommon, is when you were in Vietnam, you had an experience, one might think of it as telepathic or synchronistic, but it saved your life.
Probably, or at least my legs.
Yeah.
You're talking about an incident where I had wandered into a Viet Cong minefield.
Yeah.
Which was different from most of them. But this is one where we were in a relatively familiar area. It's a jungle terrain, and walking, and I started backing up because we were in contact. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden I just stopped. And about that time the Vietnamese lieutenant started yelling, "Mean, mean." And I looked down, and the tripwire from a mine was not only touching my heel, but I had started to put tension on it. Mm. So another few millimeters and likely would have gone off.
A landmine right at your feet.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. So, and you don't know why you stopped at that moment?
No, that's the interesting part. And I've interviewed hundreds of military personnel from combat situations. And as you mentioned earlier, this is a common kind of experience. Mm-hmm. There's something known as the point man syndrome, if you will. And the point man is the guy who has to go first when you're on patrol. And units have learned when certain guys are in the front, things are safe because they perceive danger where others might just stumble into it. Mm-hmm. So it's fairly well known, and happens. It's happened in every war. This is not unique to Vietnam or any situation. It's, I think, the sensing of being in danger. Mm-hmm. And literally life preservation. Mm-hmm.
Now, you could attribute some of that to chance, but I know that the military is actually very interested can they cultivate this kind of a faculty, or at least identify individuals who seem to possess it.
Well, actually, that varies. And a lot of this, and the things we'll discuss about the military applications, are personality dependent. It's a huge organization, tends to be quite conservative, but you have enough people who have had unusual experiences, and they're willing to explore these things. And there are others who say, nonsense, crazy. They would attribute it all to what you said, just pure chance.
Well, your service in the military occurred at a time when some of the higher up commanding officers, such as General Bert Stubblebine, with whom you worked, were openly supporting interest in the paranormal.
Yes. There were several. This is after the Vietnam era. It was at a time when we were rebuilding the military. We were a hollow army. We had people like Shai Meyer, the chief of staff of the Army level, who was giving a lot of leeway to people to go out and explore a wide range of interests because they were broken, and they knew it, and said, how do we go about fixing things? This is where this Task Force Delta came along as well.
Yeah.
But of course, with Bert, he was the head of Intelligence and Security Command. It was a worldwide organization geared at looking at adversaries. Soviet Union predominantly at that time. We're talking early 80s. And one of our concerns was that had been blindsided a few times. Sputnik is the classic example, but there were others where things suddenly appeared, technological developments that we had missed. And in Bert's position, they're not supposed to miss these things.
Right.
And his message to his subordinate commanders was, do not just disregard things because you don't understand it. Go ahead and report things that, hence the, can't happen but did, and we saw those repeatedly.
Well, for example, this is a time when there is a lot of interest in the paranormal in the culture as a whole and in the human potential movement. So I gather that people in the military felt it's important for them to stay on top of these kinds of developments. If the human potential field could help develop better soldiers, they wanted to know about it.
Yes. You'll also remember, the Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, which was a critical book that came out, and it really did influence.
1969, I believe.
Yeah, had come out and had talked about things that ostensibly the Soviet military was engaged in. And it did spur us quite a bit to look at this wide range of other topics, from human potential to the psychic. And remember, we're working with NLP, for instance.
Neuro-linguistic programming.
Right. That at different times I had both Richard Bandler and John Grinder and Tony Robbins, who was not known at that time, but had them all under contract.
Yeah.
And we were specifically looking at this issue of improving people. Now, NLP, was designed as a therapeutic modality. How do you fix broken people? Our problem was different. We had really good people, so the question was, how do we take really good people and make them excellent, improve the best of the best?
Yeah. Well, one area that's received a fair amount of publicity is the use of dowsers. I believe it occurred in Vietnam.
Yes, it did. Well, I had met Zaborg Harvlik, who was a head of the American Dowsing Society and whatnot, lived in Northern Virginia, had a chance to go down and meet with him. But one of the things that he had contracted with down at Fort Belvoir was they had, for pre-deployment training, a Viet Cong village, if you will, where people would go into. And of course, one of the big problems we had was hidden weapons, mines, all kinds of material, and usually underground. So what he had done is designed, literally teaching folks how to douse, literally sticks in hand, going out there and using that to discover hidden weapons.
And would you say it was successful?
Oh yes, it was quite successful. Again, many of these people were probably doing it on their own. Remember, we had kids that I hate to be pejorative, but coming from the backwoods where finding water and things of that was, part of their culture.
Sure.
And, they would use the literally old willow stick or L rods or things like that and find stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, and of course, it's now very well known that another technique, which I think is akin to dowsing, remote viewing, was actively pursued by the military and under the auspices, I think, of General Stubblebine, and also...
Well, there were several, but Burt was key.
Yeah.
And the difference between that and some of these other anecdotal things, this is what we call a program of record. Mm-hmm. And I know you've had Joe McMoneagle and Paul Smith and some of the other remote viewers. And so, we're talking about a formalized program.
It was a formal program, and it included laboratory research in addition.
Well, that's what I was going to say. There's a research and development piece of it.
Yeah.
How do you do this stuff?
Mm-hmm.
But there was also an active component trying to provide information on hard targets that using the remote viewers against real world situations, mm-hmm. such as what happened in Iran when our people were captured there, what happened in Beirut, the Dozier file, the brigadier general who was captured by the Red Brigade.
Yeah.
So these were very real world things, but you also had the R&D component that's, how does this stuff work?
Yeah. The military funded that work, I think, to the tune of about $20 million over a 20-year period.
Yes, that's right. But, $20 million may be big for your wallet, or certainly my checking account.
Yeah.
By Army research and development standards, we're talking lunch money,
mm-hmm.
But very important, and that they did get actively involved. And the point of being a program of record, we're reporting this to Congress. Mm-hmm. So you've got line items in the budget, and, it's very formally done. Most of the other things we did were at a funding level low enough you didn't have to really report it.
Yeah.
And that's where the personality-dependent issues came in.
Mm-hmm. Now, I gather from your recent book, Reality Denied, that you actually monitored many contracts that had to do with paranormal investigations.
Well, some of them. We did some wild and wonderful things.
Yeah.
One of the areas that I was personally most involved in probably was psychokinesis,
mm-hmm.
metal bending capabilities.
And in particular, spoon bending parties.
Right. We had Jack Houck is the one who developed it. I know Uri Geller, who did the foreword for the book, but the premise of the spoon bending parties came from Uri's capability to bend spoons.
Many people won't remember this. I was around at the time, and you were too. I actually sponsored Uri Geller's first major public appearance in the United States back in 1972. And at the time, it was like a phenomenon because he would get on the radio or on TV and demonstrate appeared to be psychokinetic metal bending, but the phone lines would start ringing, and I was at KPFA radio in Berkeley. People in their homes were reporting cutlery bending and watches that hadn't worked for years all of a sudden starting.
Yes. Well, we did. What happened was Jack Houck, who was an aerospace engineer at McDonnell Douglas, had seen this and then developed a format that became teachable. Mm-hmm. And we were very interested in it. With Uri Geller, one of the most amazing incidents that happened, he was giving a presentation in the U.S. Capitol itself. And present were a couple of senators, congressmen, mostly staffers and whatnot.
As I recall from your book, he really wanted to talk about the military situation in Israel.
Well, what he wanted to talk about was the plight of Soviet Jews and them being able to come to Israel. But it was the political aspect of that. That was his primary interest. And of course, everybody said, bend something, and he goes, I haven't got anything. Yeah. Now, we were in a skip, which is a specialized compartmented
secure room.
Secure room. So, and importantly, he did not say, "Oh, I just happened to have one in my pocket." They literally went out and got one from the guard's coffee cup, and he came in, and importantly, because I'm sitting about the distance that we are right now, and he's holding it with the bowl here, brings his finger down, the fingers did not go around it, touching this thing bent up. And then, related to what you said earlier, he put it on the back of the chair, and he went on talking, and the spoon continued to bend while he's talking and not even paying attention to it.
No one is touching it at that point.
No, it's sitting on and it fell on the floor and somehow ended up in my pocket. I still have it.
Well, now, many people think, due to the publicity from the skeptics, or I'm going to call them pseudo-skeptics, who, because that's what they are, and who hounded Uri Geller and proclaimed wildly that he's got to be a fraud. Now, you've known Uri for many years, as have I. What's your opinion? Does he ever engage in fraud?
Well, I can't speak to ever. I mean, that's a very broad statement.
Yeah.
Not in my experience. I like his comment, when people say, well, if you're so psychic, why aren't you rich? And he says, I am.
Yeah.
And he has based it on, this has to do with dowsing for minerals. That's where most of his wealth has come from, not from spoon bending. Those performances are interesting. But I was going out around the world looking for various minerals for people who have made enough money from it that... Yeah,
like the Rio Tinto Mining Company, for example. Yeah, very interesting career. And
well, Pemex was one of the big ones.
In Mexico, yes. In fact, he developed a close relationship, as I recall, with the president of Mexico at the time and his
wife. Which
wife.
got him into a bit of trouble in the U.S. There's an infamous story that I was able to check out because there's a Secret Service agent who lives in our area now.
Oh, yes.
But what happened was the president of Mexico made him a law enforcement officer and gave him a gun.
Lopez Garcia, was that the fellow?
But the point was he was flying from Mexico City to London, stopped in JFK, and was carrying a gun, and they confiscated it. And then what happened was that this Secret Service agent got involved, found no, he really is a Mexican official, had been granted that authority, and then went on to help them with Son of Sam.
Help the New York police.
Help the New York police, right.
Well, that's very significant. That was a big case. And Geller's involvement in it has never been really publicized to my knowledge.
The story is out there, but it's real. One of the things he had done is he had identified the location of Berkowitz, and it was from that, and they started looking at parking tickets. He was arrested for a parking ticket, and sure enough, the parking ticket was one of the key pieces in putting the Son of Sam case together.
In any case, back to the spoon bending parties, you became what would you call it? A leader of spoon bending parties.
Oh yes, we did. I handled dozens, I don't know how many. I lost track. See, this is where Jack Houck was good because he was an engineer and invented data collector. And every party, he kept track of who was there and how many spoons that were bent. Our interest was a little different. It wasn't so much in just bending the spoons, but it gets back to the issue I mentioned before about being blindsided. Because Subelwein was interested in using this to his commanders to say, okay, you didn't think this could happen. It did. You've experienced or seen the experience of it. Remember that when you go back to your organizations and you start getting reports that you don't fully understand. They may be wrong, but don't just disregard it a priori, which we had done in too many cases.
Well, and certainly when it comes to the paranormal and the culture in general, especially amongst educated people, professionals and the like, when they encounter something paranormal, the tendency is to push it aside, to ignore it, to pretend it didn't happen.
Very much. I had people who attended PK parties, the spoon bending parties, who you talk to them later and say, well, I wasn't there, or that didn't happen. I've thought about it, couldn't have happened, so even though they had personal experience, chose to disregard it. Now, you've hit on a key issue, and I don't know if you want to digress a bit, and that has to do with belief systems. But I think this is really key. As you know, I do work with other countries around the world, and particularly Brazil. The point here is we grew up in the Western educational system, very materialistically oriented. You know, everything cut it into smaller and smaller pieces. The difference between here and, say, Brazil, and I deal with very senior people down there, is they went to the same educational systems, but culturally are willing to accept a spiritual world, or the spiritist kinds of things go on. And they can integrate those concepts that apparently are seemingly incongruent.
Yeah.
But I would argue they aren't. But we just disregard it for all the issues that you articulated.
Well, I think in North America, people are, professionals in particular, afraid they'll be laughed at. And there are people who make a point of laughing at them, whereas in a culture like Brazil, this is not considered a laughing matter in the same way.
One of the things I've tried to do in the book, I talk about many of the issues that happen to me, but the real point is these happen to everybody. And I've got a couple of agenda items that I admit to. One is to try to make it more permissible for best and brightest scientists to get involved in these areas. And another is to get people to talk about it, because I really don't like the word paranormal, because these things are normal. But may be rare, but that doesn't mean that they are different from. And a lot of this has to do, you know, vocabulary or thinking about it. We're willing to relegate it to weird, terribly complex, whatever we're dealing with. And as you know, I've dealt with a wide range of phenomena. I do think they're all interrelated. I do think that consciousness is a key piece of this. I point out that, you know, whatever we're dealing with is at least as complex as cancer or AIDS. And I think one of the things that will be very helpful is for people to tell other people about the things that have happened to them. From ESP, you know, clairvoyant experiences, precognition, near-death experiences, far more common than most people believe.
And you have gone out of your way to seek out these experiences and study them. And you make a point of looking for the most bizarre experiences. So I commend you for that.
Well, one of my, again, admonitions to people is go do it. It's not just a matter of studying it or reading papers on it or that. These experiences are available basically to anybody who gets involved. And as I said, most people have had them just on a continuous basis. They just sometimes don't recognize it, but on others, they just don't want to sound crazy, you know, and, you know, to even friends and family, let alone telling scientists or doctors.
Well, I have to say, though, you were in something of a privileged position, being a military officer and having a general who was supporting your interest in the paranormal and encouraging you to go out and find new unexplained things.
Yes, we did. This was operating under General Stubblebine. There were several others, but one thing I'd point out is this is generally personality dependent, because when Bert retired, I mean, these efforts got, it got transferred initially and later killed, and a lot of it had to do with zero-sum game funding process, but a lot of it was, you know, personality. Who is going to support these efforts?
Well, I think there are real questions about whether large bureaucracies in general are capable of managing research programs in parapsychology.
Well, I've done a lot of work in creativity, and my point there to most people is be careful what you ask for. These organizations all state, we want to be creative, we want to that, and you say, well, maybe not that creative, you know, because people come in. And if you're going to do work with creativity, you've also got to reinforce failure. Unfortunately, and this is where the military is particularly bad, they're very results-oriented. And sort of failure is not an option, is the mindset. And if you're going to be really creative, you're going to fail sometimes because, as I pointed out, if you're almost getting the answer you expect, you're nowhere close to the edge.
Mm-hmm. Well, you write in your book, Reality Denied, about some experiences that were technically considered failures, but that you believe had a lot of merit to them. One of them you refer to known as the Hutchinson effect.
Yes. That was one that is really highly controversial. It began, George Hathaway and another Canadian had shown us a film of some things that looked really, really strange. We had items that were levitating, accelerating, burning. One of the problems was the range of effects.
Yeah.
So in that case, I actually paid them to recreate the situation, which they did with John Hutchison. Who was your worst nightmare? Nice guy, but no scientific background whatsoever.
He was the inventor.
Yeah, he was you talk about the mad inventor, that was him. Mm-hmm. And actually, he had discovered a number of these things kind of spontaneously. He was interested in sparks. And so initially, he was sitting in his room. He had all these contraptions. Yeah. One of the things he had done is look at Nikola Tesla and look at what's the pictures of his workbench, and from that try to figure out what was going on.
He would buy used equipment of various types.
And absolutely no control over the situation or anything. What happened in the meantime is he got kicked out of his apartment because he was interfering. Remember, the television went, through the air in those days.
The neighbors were complaining.
Yeah, it was. The neighbors were not happy, shall we say.
Yeah. But the U.S. military took an interest.
Well, we did for a while. The problem was that we had agreed we would have a show and tell at a specific point. There were some things that happened that I am personally convinced happened. I had given him a number of samples, and we had them under controlled conditions. One of the most interesting, we had some small molybdenum rods. They're very strong, and I had them for the PK parties, and nobody had ever been able to bend one. And damned if when I went up there, they gave me one with a slight S-curve in it. So what happened, though, is we had the show and tell date, and I had 4 guys from INSCOM, including myself, and 2 from Los Alamos, and one of them was one of the people you've discussed before, and this is the just flat debunker, And the problem was that during the time when things were supposed to take place, nothing happened. And most unfortunate, instead of writing a report, we saw nothing happen, they wrote a scathing report and actually suggested that Tom Bearden, local U.S. guy, had slipped into the country somehow and manipulated it. Had absolutely nothing to do with it. But that was enough to kill, our particular ends. I couldn't get further funding on it. But here's one where Jack Houck and McDonnell Douglas came along and supported it. John, to this day, continues to have strange things happen.
John Hutchinson.
Yes. The problem, frankly, is control. You cannot control the effects, but they're certainly interesting.
And we'll show some pictures because from your book so that our viewers can get a feeling for...
some of the material we saw. And, for instance, they showed me he had a crankshaft. Remember, he's grabbing crap literally out of the junkyard.
Yeah.
And had exposed to it. They took it to BC Hydro for testing. And the same piece of metal on one end is case-hardened steel, on the other end is, soft as lead. And it just from being exposed to things. We had PVC that literally was pulverized and disappeared. Another one, they took a rat tail file, put it between 2 wooden boards, put it in there. It lit up just like, remember the old incandescent light bulbs? Sure. We have a wire across there, and just like that, it lights up. Got to the point the whole file, which is as big as my finger, just lit up and broke apart.
Split in 2.
The interesting piece was, this had been white hot, they reached in and picked it up, and it was cold.
That was pretty risky.
Yes. But the problem, again, it gets back to control. I mean, scientists want things that are, can be replicated on a routine basis.
Well, but sometimes it takes a long time before you get there.
Sure.
I mean, you mentioned the incandescent light bulb. As I recall, Edison tried like thousands of filaments before he found the tungsten that actually worked the best.
Right.
It doesn't always happen overnight.
And this, by the way, I mean, just being exposed to the field. It wasn't wired into anything. It was just the fields that he was generating. But he couldn't control the field. And frequently, we have stuff with cameras watching it, and you'd be staring at it, and something happens just off camera. I know we've talked about that with Skinwalker Ranch and places like that as well. Like precognitive sentient phenomena, but it occurs in spades in these things. Very frustrating from a research perspective.
Well, I know in your book you speculate that this might be what is known as a psychotronic effect.
I don't understand the effect, but a psychotronic I would buy, certainly, yes.
Yeah. In other words, as I recall, you talked to Hutchinson and asked him, "Are you doing any of this?
Well, that's
are you the
another
agent?"
Key point, because when I talked to John, I said, "Are you part of the system?" In other words, he's physically interacting with it at a psychic level. He said yes. I've had mixed response from that. One side observed him say he said he could tell it was going to happen because he'd get excited and then the event would happen. The others would say no, the event would happen and then he'd get excited. So it's kind of hard to tell.
But it's a funny thing because conventionally we think of subject and object as being distinct from each other, and yet there's a lot of theoretical work, especially coming out of quantum physics, that says that's an illusion, the subjective and objective. It's all one system.
All is Maya.
Well, now, speaking of the ability of somebody to know in advance when something is going to happen, you describe in your book, it's worth mentioning, a case in which you were visiting some people who had many paranormal experiences associated with orbs and lights in the sky and UFOs. And on one occasion, you witnessed something similar.
If you're talking about the Chris Bledsoe case,
yes.
That could be an entire program with the complexity of it, but it's absolutely real. The orb aspect actually happened here. We were up on Mount Charleston. He and some other friends were visiting Las Vegas. We went up on Mount Charleston to literally play games with UFOs. We were sending up balloons with chem lights on them and things like that. So if people looked, they did see a UFO. But what was interesting is I had taken a series of photographs, and at times they would be perfectly clear, and then the next frame, you're seeing these orbs appearing in there. I get, on a relatively routine basis, I get a video taken from him. Some of these, by the way, are in the visual spectrum. You have some question where, once you've developed film or however it's working now with digital technology, you see these things. But they have interaction, like I say, where you can actually see.
Will you describe an instance where you were with him on his property, and at one point he said, "I can feel they're coming"?
Oh, that's a bit different. No, that we had gone down to the Cape Fear River, where his initial experience had happened.
Yeah.
By the way, this is a series of incidents that are continuing to this day.
This is was it North or South Carolina?
North Carolina.
North Carolina.
Near Fayetteville. And we had gone on the Cape Fear River, and he had explained where he'd seen the UFOs and what their interactions had been, and hiding from creepy crawlers. I mean, it's a terribly complex case.
Yeah.
Went back up to the car. As now it had become dark. Victoria and his daughter Emily had gotten in the back seat, and Chris and I were leaning against the fender.
Your wife, Victoria.
Yeah. And he's describing, showing me where things are, what the relative positions were, and all of a sudden, oh, I think they're here. And within, maybe 10 seconds, this thing pops into view and goes zipping off.
Yeah.
And it didn't fly in from someplace. I mean, it literally materialized and went zipping off to the south. And I saw it. And the point here is the temporal relationship between him saying, something's going to happen, and then it happening.
Because when we were talking about Hutchinson earlier, he had done something similar. And
yeah, well, he had said that. Like I say, there's something going on. But the problem with John Hutchison is these things happen kind of all the time, but the same way, in an uncontrolled basis. Yeah. And you never know what's going to happen or when.
Yeah. Well, your book is so rich. There are probably 50 different examples of some of these case studies that you were involved in. But getting back to the military, you achieved a certain amount of notoriety because of your association with a popular film, Men Who Stare at Goats.
And that came along later, but yes.
But it does have to do with your background in the martial arts and military interest in what can be done using martial arts techniques, particularly for soldiers who have been captured.
Well, first of all, Goats was based on a book by the same name by John Ronson. And in the book, there's no doubt who we are. They used our real names. The problem that I saw was he took about this much truth and he wrote this much, and then they made the movie. So Clooney is sort of a composite character. The point was that, goats never died from being stared at, but they did apply something called dim mak, which is known as the death touch, which basically is a high-level martial arts system, again, if you believe it, but you have to understand how ki flows, how acupuncture works, and things like that. And the idea is they would hit the goat, and then at a later time, it's not like bang, and the goat goes down. You touch it, and it was like 12 hours later, all of a sudden the goat goes plop. And the point was that, and I saw the necropsy on this, the death was so fast that the heart didn't even contract. I've tried talking to cardiologists and say, how is it? Because normally in the death throes, your heart would contract, but the ventricles were full of blood. The more interesting aspect to me is I saw, the necropsy across the thoracic region. You saw a line going through there. And this is similar, if you've seen how bullets transit a body going through and then radiating energy. You saw this pathway of energy going across the body, but no wound of entrance or wound of exit.
So this is a technique that the military took some interest in.
Well, there were certain people. What had happened was that they had created a course called Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, or SERE. And the guy they brought in was Nick Rowe. And Nick had been a prisoner of the Viet Cong for 5 years. Just so happens he was in my general area in the Delta, and we'd get stories about him, being seen, a round eye being seen with the Viet Cong. Recovered him just as I was leaving, 69, managed to escape. But they brought him and said, who better to run an evasion course than somebody with 5 years personal experience? And one of the things he had found was he could use mental techniques, not to do big things. This idea of Rambo, you're going to jump up and whip ass and all that, that's not happening after you've been in captivity. But he found that he could influence the guards, maybe just to walk a little farther, to look someplace for a while, giving them time to do something else. So what he did is sent a couple of medics out to look at this range of technology, including dim Mac. And that's what they were doing, and it was, as I said, captured on film, but there really is a goat lab there. And a bit sensitive, but it's there to train medics, so that the first gunshot wound you see is not a human on the battlefield.
Well, to shift gears a bit, another area that you were involved in helping the military take a closer look at is the research of Cleve Baxter.
Yes. Yeah, we did, and I've done a whole chapter in there. Cleve Baxter is the one some people will know of who is getting communication from plants.
He's featured very extensively in the classic book, The Secret Life of Plants.
Correct. And what actually it started with a failed experiment, if you will. He had a plant in his office.
He was a lie detector expert.
Well,
basically.
now Cleve, first of all, was the guy who developed the polygraph system, as we know, not the polygraph, but the system that is still used to this day, the Baxter Comparative Zone System. He was a bachelor, interested in a range of phenomena, including astrology and whatnot. But the question that he had is, I got a plant here. If I pour water on the roots, how long does it take the liquid to reach the leaves? So he hooked up a plant. They have GSR, the galvanic skin response, which basically is measuring liquid, and saw that, but he forgot about it. And he left it running, and it was hooked up to the polygraph, so he had a chart going. And over time, he noticed periodically they're getting wiggles. They're getting reports on the chart. And so I said, what's that? So then, long and involved set of experiments, but he found out that plants referred to things like touch, pain, even thoughts,
of people in their vicinity.
Yeah, well, that as well. Well, he was the one who said he'd tear a leaf and he'd see a remark on the graph. He would burn the leaf, and then he said he found that if he just thought about burning the leaf, it was enough to get a response. Fast forward a number of iterations, and so we found that there were oral leukocytes, the white cells from the mouth, and he started doing experimentation with those, and that's where I came in. And developed a parallel system. I had him under contract. He showed us how to work it. But what we did basically is we'd take white cells out, centrifuge, put them in a small container with electrodes in it, in a shielded cage at a distance.
So the white cells presumably are going to react to the emotions of the donor.
Well, that's what we thought. Now, of course, there is no, if you have the materialistic viewpoint, that shouldn't happen.
Right.
I mean, how can you take white cells from your mouth and have them respond at a distance? And we had experiences up to 50 miles away, frankly, where I'd left the cells running. The classic experiment, though, was that the Army had asked National Academy of Science, National Research Council, to do a study on a wide range of phenomena. And I had appeared before them several times. So we invited them. They were going to meet at the Salk Institute in San Diego, and that's where Cleve's, his office was very close to that. We arranged for them to come in. So I arrived first, and if you're going to run experiments before the academy, you want to make sure it's working. So that day, I donated my white cells just to make sure the damn thing's working. There was nothing secret about it. And then the plan was that we were going to take all of the people into the classroom, but two of them would go with his lab assistant to this other wing of the building, that's some distance away, several hundred feet away, concrete walls and all of that in between. So the thesis was that Cleve would explain the experiment, say you got to do it quickly, we got to keep their attention. I would get up in a minute or two and say, okay, I've independently replicated the experience. And then we would take them to the lab and they would get to see it for themselves. Well, Cleve turned out to be one of the people, if you ask him what time it is, he'd give you the history of chronometers. Meaning he was running on and on.
He was boring your very respectable audience.
Yes, and I'm getting nervous, frankly. Like, geez, we got to spit up. So finally it becomes my turn to talk. And so I start telling him. Now remember, the thesis is it's responding to your emotional state. About 90 seconds later, the door flies open, and in runs the lab assistant and says, what happened a minute and a half ago? I said, well, that's when I started talking. And it says, you look over, the graph is going wild. For hours it had been, just like this. And suddenly they've got, hitting the stoppers on the chart.
As soon as you started speaking.
And this is when I started. Now, I can tell you that telling the National Academy of Science members that the universe is not built the way they think it is can be an emotionally stimulating event.
Sure.
And then it went along with this high beam, and then it dropped off. And then when I walk in the room, you see a blip, and then it got torn off because they were looking at the graph and just tore it off the machine. Interestingly, not a word in the report about it.
From the National Academy.
Yeah.
I see. Well, it was, I guess, from their point of view, maybe an unplanned event, not a formal experiment.
Well, I hadn't planned. Like I said, I had actually forgotten that the thing was running. We did not set it up to monitor me. I just wanted to make sure the graphs were working the way it was supposed to. We were going to take two of their people, have them do it. Interesting anecdote that people who work in this field might appreciate. They're in there. We went over to the lab finally, and they've looked at the chart, and Cleve is describing, what's going on. And one of the donors is sitting just staring intently and stops and goes, it goes, you see? I tried to make it move and nothing happened. As soon as I stopped, it jumped. Parapsychologists say, but of course.
Yeah. That's often how it works.
Yes.
You have to try, and then relax.
Yes. And it's when he relaxed.
But he took it as confirmation that it didn't work.
Right.
Because of his predisposition. Well, and I gather these days the military is not publicly or actively pursuing these kinds of projects.
Well, you're back to the same issue that we had even then. That's personality dependent. And, when I worked in the Pentagon, I used to run around and looking for this guy, says the Pentagon says this. The Pentagon doesn't say anything. It's a big stone building.
Yeah.
The military is made up with hundreds of thousands, literally millions of people.
Right.
And they come with a wide range of belief system and interest. But they also come with a wide range of people who have had these experiences.
No doubt.
And some of them, once they get, it's like Bert didn't, when he started in the Army, he didn't say, I'm going to go do sponsor remote viewing and that. It wasn't until he got senior enough he was in a position where he could make some of these things happen.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's the way a lot of these things happen. But again, people have these experiences, and when they get to position, some of them are willing to do it. Now, the military generally is risk aversive, so it is not career enhanced. Like pilots generally don't report UFO experiences because it's not what we call career enhancing.
Yeah. And in fact, as far as I know, many of the people who were in the remote viewing program felt that was the end of their advancement. Once they'd been in that program, there's no further possibility.
In general, that was true.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. There were definitely career blocks, but there was a program where people could get into highly specializing, but you had very definite limits as to how far you were going to advance. So, like I say, if your idea was to make rank and move up, for most of people, it was a career-ending experience.
Well, John Alexander, I hope that a conversation like ours and the books that you're writing will inspire some people to continue the tradition of exploration that you have certainly embodied.
Well, I hope they will go do it and just admit what's already going on in their life.
Mm-hmm. John, thank you so much for being with me.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you for being with us.